Well, I'm a congressman. I'm a representative from the state of Maryland. And our family suffered a devastating catastrophe on the last day of December of 2020. Our middle child, our son Tommy, who was then a law student at Harvard, but he was home because of COVID-19, was suffering depression, and he took his life on the last day of the year in 2020. And that was the worst thing that ever happened to us, and a terrible event. And Tommy was a beautiful, brilliant young man who had great passion for a lot of things, including human rights and animal rights and animal welfare. And he had a lot of wonderful talents. He was a poet, he was a piano player, and he was just a delight. He was pure joy for us. But he was battling depression, and the COVID-19 period was a very dark, isolating period for young people. And he succumbed, and he wrote us a note which said, "Please forgive me my illness one today. Look after each other, the animals and the global poor. For me, all my love, Tommy." So that was a terrible event for us and for his friends and for our community. So 6 days later, we just had a family service at the gravesite for Tommy in Montgomery County, Maryland, where we live, because no funerals were allowed because of COVID-19. So it was just 20 members of our family who attended. That was January the 5th. The very next day was January the 6th. That was the day which, under our Constitution, the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate get together to count our electoral college votes. The electoral college votes are votes that come from the states, reflecting the popular vote in the states. And there's no mystery in it. Joe Biden had won 306 electoral votes. Donald Trump had won 232 electoral votes. In the popular vote, Biden had won more than 7 million votes than Trump did. But Trump was running around the country saying that he had really won the election, and the election was stolen, and there had been fraud, and there had been corruption. And he was making these very general allegations with no proof. And he attracted all of these bizarre conspiracy theorists to his cause who were just making things up. But you couldn't keep up with all of the lies that were being told on the internet. So on January 6th, the day after we had Tommy's service, I had to come to Congress. Our two daughters, Hannah and Tabitha, and sons-in-law and other family members were urging me not to go, but I said I had to go because it's in the Constitution. It was a requirement because Trump was going to make this a very difficult process, and Speaker Pelosi had asked me to be one of the leaders on the House floor answering the various false allegations about the election. And the other thing was that because we were in the thick of the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of members of Congress were getting sick and then suddenly would call in and say they couldn't show up. And we have a very narrow majority. We had a very narrow majority of Democrats over Republicans, so we needed everybody there. So for a whole bunch of reasons, I had to go. So our youngest daughter, Tabitha, decided to come with me, and so did our older daughter, Hannah's husband, Hank. They said, we'll come with you. So they came with me that day. Tabitha asked me whether it would be dangerous, and I said, no, we're in the capital of the United States, and there will be protests outside from Trump's fans, but it won't be dangerous. So the Republican members began to object to the Electoral College votes being cast by certain states. And they were lining it up to object to Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. And we were in the middle of the debate about objections to Arizona. And I had just spoken and explained that in the Electoral College process, our job as members of Congress is not to vote for the candidate we favor. Our job is simply to ratify the votes that come out of the states. And we have a purely mechanical function. It was ministerial. It was not a substantive job to decide who we wanted. And the election was over, the people had spoken, and our job was just to count the electors and receive them. The Republicans were getting up making all kinds of outlandish, false allegations about the election. And then, meantime, we started to get messages on our telephones that there was a mob outside the Capitol which was clashing with the police and trying to get into the building. And so a friend of mine who's an actress, wrote me to say, are you okay? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, the building has been breached. The mob has entered the Capitol. So immediately I thought about Tabitha and Hank, who were in a nearby room outside of the Capitol chamber. And I called them and my chief of staff who was with them to make sure they were okay. They locked themselves into that room. Tabitha and Hank hid under the desk. My chief of staff took a fire poker out of the fireplace and wielded it like a weapon in case anybody got into the room. But what we learned was that hundreds of people had entered the Capitol after assaulting the federal officers. The first thing I was thinking about was that somebody would have an assault weapon, because that's the way a lot of these things go in our country, whether we're talking about a church, a mosque, a synagogue, an elementary school, a bar, a restaurant, a Walmart, a supermarket. Somebody comes in with an AR-15 military-style assault weapon and starts shooting everyone. Well,
you were not thinking about a coup at that moment?
No, we were thinking, most of us were thinking that we were going to be shot. And of course, I wasn't worried about myself because I was so devastated about Tommy. I was just thinking about Tabitha and Hank, and I couldn't believe I'd gotten her into that situation, So they told everybody to take out gas masks under our seats. We didn't even know we had gas masks under the seats. They told everybody to get down. A lot of the members were taking off these little pins that we wear, which get us into the building. They said the pin will make you recognizable to the mob or the terrorists or whoever is doing this, whoever has entered the building. There were some members of Congress who were having panic attacks. And And then I heard this very loud sound, just boom, 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 of the mob trying to get into the House chamber where we were. And so everybody on the floor tried to move towards the door to reinforce the door. And then police officers came in with their guns drawn and moved us all out of the way and went up to the door and held their guns at the door to try to hold the mob back. The Speaker of the House, Speaker Pelosi, was escorted out along with Kevin McCarthy, who was the Republican minority leader. A few moments before that, the new chaplain of the House got up and gave a prayer. And then my friend Jim McGovern, who's a congressman from Massachusetts, he tried to take the dais and to resume the deliberations, but it was impossible. And then the security people said, just shut it down. And we were all shepherded and moved off of the floor. The members who were up in the gallery were basically locked in up there. They couldn't get out for a while. And they were there because on the Democratic side, we were respecting the COVID-19 protocols of having 2 seats between the members, and so we ran out of space. So the Democratic members had gone up to the gallery where the public is usually sitting. On the Republican side, they didn't respect the COVID-19 protocols, and so they were all down there. A lot of the Democrats had tried to get over to the Republican side because they thought if a shooter came in, they were less likely to be shot if they were over on the Republican side of the House chamber. But it was real chaos with the people who were stuck up there. But anyway, they got us out on the first floor. But first, there was an effort to breach the speaker's lobby and to get in by the mob. And that's where Ashley Babbitt was shot by the Capitol officer when she was the first one to try to break in, and he shot her. There was an investigation later which found that he had done the right thing. So all of us were escorted out and down into the basement of the Capitol to try to get back over to the House office buildings where we would end up taking shelter in the Ways and Means Committee room. And then that began the process. I describe it in my book of just trying to get Tabitha and Hank and my chief of staff out of where they were, get the police to them, because they were still over in the Capitol where the mob had invaded. And at that point, the members, we were all determined to go back in and to complete the counting of the Electoral College votes because we never got through it. We were still hearing the objections to various states, which means that we had not chosen the president yet. And we had expected a whole bunch of fraudulent parliamentary objections, but we had not imagined that the protest that Trump had called for outside the Capitol would merge with these parliamentary enemies of the election and to try to overthrow the whole process. But they were very focused on getting Vice President Pence to step outside of his constitutional role. He was simply supposed to be presiding over the proceeding and to make sure that the counting all happened. They wanted him to reject Electoral College votes coming from the states and essentially to declare that Donald Trump was the victor, or to kick it into a so-called contingent election in the House of Representatives, where under the arcane, intricate rules of the Electoral College, the House would vote not on the basis of one member, one vote, but on the basis of one state delegation per vote. So California would get one vote, South Carolina would get one vote, New York would get one vote, Montana would get one vote. And doing it that way, Trump clearly would have won because the Republicans controlled 27 state delegations. the Democrats controlled 22 states. And one state, Pennsylvania, was split down the middle with a 9-9 tie within the delegation. So their plan was to try to get it into a contingent election in the House so that Trump could win the election in that way. Vice President Pence, to his great credit, refused to go along with it. It was probably the first time he said no to Donald Trump about anything, but it was so obviously a violation of his constitutional oath and his constitutional duty that he said he wouldn't do it. And that's why when the mob came and tried to break into the chamber, they were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." That's Donald Trump's own vice president. That's his running mate, his handpicked vice president, but they were talking about assassinating him because he refused to go along with Trump's plan to overturn the election. In any event, the Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police Department from Washington were basically on their own. Donald Trump, as the commander-in-chief, did not alert the armed forces. He did not activate the National Guard for Washington, D.C., but there were enough police reinforcements from surrounding areas. The National Guard from Virginia was sent, the National Guard from Maryland was sent, that we were able to restore order in the building. And they were able to do bomb checks and so on and declare that we could go back in. And we went back in that evening around 8 o'clock. Tabitha and Hank went back home. Somebody drove them back to our house. It went on for several hours more. They continued to object to the Electoral College votes, but in the middle of the night, I think it was around 2 or 3 in the morning, we finally certified that Joe Biden had won the election, having survived what was really an attempt at a political coup and a violent insurrection backing up the coup. And so that was on Wednesday, January 6th. 1 week after that, the House of Representatives voted on Wednesday, January 13th, to impeach Donald Trump for inciting a violent insurrection against the Union. This was an impeachment article that I drafted with 2 of my colleagues, and we pretty much drafted it on January 6th and January 7th. The House also voted to try to activate the provisions of the 25th Amendment, which says that if the president cannot discharge the duties of his office, the powers of the presidency should be transferred to the vice president. And so we called upon the vice president to activate the provisions of the 25th Amendment and to call the cabinet together for that purpose. I'd introduced that resolution too. That passed overwhelmingly in the House, but the vice president said he refused to do that, that would just further disturb the country. So after the vice president said no, then we moved to impeach the president. The House voted to impeach the president. Speaker Pelosi asked me to be the lead impeachment manager for the House of Representatives to go over to the Senate, because after there's an impeachment, the Senate conducts a trial to determine whether or not to convict the president, and it requires a 2/3 vote. So that trial began on February 7th, just a few weeks later. So I spent several weeks getting ready for that, and we started it on February 7th. We were over in the Senate for a week, and we actually ended up with a bipartisan vote, which was the largest vote in American history to convict a president. There's never been a conviction of a president, and the vote was 57-43, which was not enough to convict him. We needed 67 votes, but it was still the largest vote in the history of the country in a Senate trial to convict the president. The evidence we had was overwhelming, even though it was still very early and we had not been able to conduct a real investigation, but we went based on the public record of the statements of Donald Trump and how he had incited the crowd. Trump had told the crowd that they have to fight like hell, and if they don't fight like hell, there won't be a country anymore, and there are very different rules when there's cheating involved, and they had cheated, and this was the biggest scam in American history, the biggest ripoff, and so on. And 150 police officers were wounded or injured, broken arms, broken legs, heart attacks, strokes, broken jaws, broken noses. It was like medieval combat out there, as a number of the police officers described it, hour after hour after hour. And Donald Trump did nothing but sit in the room right off of the Oval Office and watch it on TV. So it's really the greatest crime in American presidential history to incite an insurrection against the government in order to execute a political coup and overturn an election and keep himself in office. Yeah, I mean, I was well prepared for every manner of outlandish, ridiculous argument, and we were prepared for every outrageous parliamentary maneuver, but we were still thinking in conventional terms about what would be done. And they were thinking like authoritarians, like fascists. You know, how you create a situation of extremes, so extreme that anything can happen. And we think that the plan was for Trump to be declared president, either by the Republicans in Congress or by Mike Pence or whoever they were going to get to take Mike Pence's place. And then to have Trump come to the Capitol, which was what he kept saying, I want to drive there, I want to go there, and then to ride in like Mussolini and declare himself president and impose a state of siege, martial law in the country, and say, Nancy Pelosi can't keep order here, but I can keep order, and I'm going to call in the National Guard now, after it was over, to put down the chaos he had unleashed against us. So there were a number of people, including in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said it was like the Reichstag fire. That he was going to create the pretext for the military to come in and call it over, and he was going to declare himself the hero of the crisis that he had created.
Yeah, I've heard an interview with you in the Great Synagogue, and you said that the two words you haven't used often enough during the last years, perhaps, or the last month, was fascism and suicide.
Yes.
Can you explain this a little bit more? Because, I mean, when you talk about fascism, of course in Germany, this reminds us to the Weimar Republic and what happened before the National Socialism came up, or
yes,
it came up. So, do you see
well, first on suicide, you know, I feel a lot of regret and self-recrimination about not speaking in much more explicit detail and much more depth with Tommy about suicide. And I think I was proceeding on the erroneous theory that if you talk about suicide, it will make it more likely. You will it into being, but it's really quite the reverse. If you don't talk about it, it endows it with a kind of power that it shouldn't have, you know. So I don't know how much difference it might have made, but I feel very I feel regretful about that and despondent about that. But so, you know, it's been a very tough time in our country for young people with Trump, with COVID-19, with everything we've been through, you know. So I think we just need to talk about mental health and emotional health. We got to talk about the problem of suicide. And I just vowed that I would do that, you know. But fascism is the same thing. I mean, it was considered impolite in American political discourse to talk about fascism or call someone a fascist. Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, right before she died, wrote a book called Fascism, A Warning, and she said she was going to use the F word because she said fascism does not have one fixed ideological content. It mutates. It's a strategy for taking power outside of the normal legal process, outside of the authorized process, and the fascist will do anything to claim power. The hallmark of the fascist political party is it does not respect the outcome of public elections, and it embraces political violence or refuses to disavow political violence as an instrument for obtaining power. And if those are hallmarks of a fascist political party, those are hallmarks of Donald Trump's party now. He's taken one of the world's great political parties, the Republican Party, created by Abraham Lincoln, whose bust I have right there on my desk. They've taken Abraham Lincoln's party, they've turned it into an authoritarian cult of personality. It operates like the Church of Scientology or a right-wing religious cult with a fanatical messianic leader who tells everybody what to do.
The supporters of the Republicans and of Trump, they are coming. I mean, in Germany we often say it comes from the middle of the society, from those who have fears. Who is supporting this authoritarian idea of Trump?
Well, he has taken over the Republican Party, so it is now Republican Party orthodoxy. He was president of the United States. He is the front runner for the 2024 presidential nomination. He is the leader of the Republican Party. I mean, we have to call things as they are. It's a reality. It's an overwhelmingly white political formation behind him. It's more male than female. But it's a lot of people who have been mobilized around racism, misogyny, immigrant bashing, anti-Semitism. A lot of the traditional enemies of democracy, in ideological terms, have regrouped under Trumpism. And Trump is, despite all of his rhetoric about globalism, he is in league globally with every autocrat, theocrat, plutocrat, dictator, tyrant on earth, starting with his hero Vladimir Putin, who has been working to destabilize our democracy and destabilize and undermine democracies all over the world, including Germany, including France. Their team is Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, El-Sisi in Egypt, Marcos in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, who attempted his own January 6th on January the 8th in Brazil to overturn a democratic election. And you name it. And they're all, Xi in China, they're all betting on the failure of American democracy. And they're all invested in the failure of American democracy. And with all of our many faults and problems, we remain the world's greatest multiracial, multi-ethnic, immigrant constitutional democracy. And so the democratic governments and movements of the world have a lot invested in the success of American democracy, just like the autocrats and dictators have a lot invested in the failure of American democracy.
So what gives you the strength to continue with your struggle against Trump after all these experiences you made during the last 2 years?
Well, we can't let him win. We cannot. I think it was a shock to a lot of people how much support he got by pandering to people's fanaticism, extremism, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism. But at this point, we are battle-hardened. We've been through it. We've seen what we're up against. When Donald Trump first ran for office in 2016, he had never run for office before. He had never served in government before. And he, like a lot of fascists, he's a chameleon. He dances all over the place. So people didn't know what his politics were. Sometimes he would be pro-choice, sometimes he would be anti-choice, sometimes he'd be pro-gay rights, sometimes he'd be anti-gay rights. He'd be all over the place. Some people thought he was running to the left of Hillary Clinton. He denounced Hillary Clinton for her ties to Wall Street, her receiving $50,000 at lunch with Goldman Sachs, an investment firm. I mean, he ran a clever campaign. He said he would not get the country into wars. He attacked the Iraq War, even though he had supported the Iraq War. But you didn't know where he was coming from. So he got a lot of support from people who came to regret it. But this time, that was in 2016. This time, he's running for election again. And after the January 6th insurrection and after his lethal recklessness with COVID-19, after everything...
After a trial against him. Mm-hmm.
Yes. I mean, after he's been found by a court to be a sexual abuser and a defamer of women. After all of that, we know exactly who he is. And he's running on an explicitly authoritarian program. You know, he says he wants the military to take over states and cities run by Democrats, Democrat mayors and governors. He wants to build the wall again, which he said he was going to make Mexico pay for. Mexico did not pay for it. Then he tried to get the American people to pay for it. We wouldn't pay for it. But, you know, he's got all of his tricks again. We are up against an authoritarian movement under Donald Trump. I mean, this is American-style fascism.
What is the role of civil society during the next 1.5 years?
Well, fascism is the enemy of civil society. And so civil society has to stand up for democracy, for democratic institutions and the rule of law. And human rights. But Trump now is carrying a program that the right wing all over the world is promoting. Racist, anti-immigrant, anti-gay, illiberal democracy is what Orban calls it in Hungary.
Yeah, these are all the negative things. What do you think can we do to build a bridge between our countries in this struggle?
Well, the democratic countries and parties and leaders and movements have to be as organized as the authoritarians are in order to defeat them. And so the democratic legislatures of the countries have got to be in constant touch, and the democratic forces within civil society, the churches, the businesses, the universities, all have to be standing up for democratic values and democratic institutions. I mean, that's our assignment.
You have the feeling that this is happening already? Are there ties between these sectors in Germany and the US?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think the struggle to defend democracy in Ukraine against Russian invasion has been an important battle for unifying the forces of democracy and freedom against the autocrats and the dictators. And I think that the democracies of the world understand how crucial the fight in Ukraine is for democracy, the rule of law, and national sovereignty against an autocrat pulling the wool over the eyes of his own people in order to wage an imperial war of aggression against a neighbor. So I think that's a good case study of how the democracies can cooperate in order to stand up against the spread of authoritarianism. But obviously we need to do more with it. The authoritarian forces and despots have figured out how to use the internet, and I think that the democratic forces need to catch up.
And what about the international peace movement? You know, in Germany, also in the Social Democratic Party, we have opponents against the militarization of Germany after years of fighting for peace.
Yes.
And they don't want to weaponize the society, and this discussion is very, very difficult in Germany,
yes,
especially for the government. Is such a discussion here in the US too? And I mean,
well, it's not as sharp here as I know it is in Germany. I've been following the debate in Germany about it. And it's a difficult problem because, the progressive forces around the world have resisted militarism and the power of military industrial complexes that have gotten us into a lot of imperial aggressive wars, like the war in Iraq. Yes. I mean, the war in Iraq is a perfect example of that, which is, a war I marched against many times, including with Tommy, who came with me and marched against the war in Iraq. So that has been a major commitment of the progressive forces to try to reduce war and the use of war as an instrument of domination and control. The problem is that that's exactly how Russia is using the war in Ukraine. It is a war of domination and control against a democratic society. They're trying to destroy Ukraine's national sovereignty and Ukraine's democracy, and violating human rights in a horrific way, with all kinds of atrocities taking place in the prosecution of the war. So we would think of this in democratic terms as a just war of self-defense against an imperial aggressor and tyrant. So that's a very different thing from us being in the position of being the aggressor, like in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was obviously a nightmare for the people of Iraq, but there are things we could have done through international law to try to deal with Saddam Hussein, as opposed to engaging in a war which cost tens of thousands of people their lives. And that was a war based on lies about weapons of mass destruction.
What do you think about the situation of Afghanistan now?
Well, look, the real problem that I hope Putin is finding, and that America found in Iraq and in Afghanistan, is that war doesn't work. Whether or not, you are, a categorical anti-war pacifist, or you are a military strategist, I think we have to concede that war is not working. I mean, the wars that America's gotten in since World War II have not worked for our country. Vietnam did not work, the Iraq War did not work, the Afghan War did not work, but trillions of dollars sunk into it, and let's hope that Putin finds that war doesn't work. But people still have a right to defend themselves and to defend their democratic aspirations and the lives of their people against authoritarian monsters like Putin, who decide to use war as an instrument of their power. Originally, a lot of people said to me, what do these things have to do with each other?
The two traumas.
The loss of your son, what happened on January 6th, and then the story of the impeachment and the trial of Donald Trump. And I said, well, they were all integrated in my life and in my perception of what has been happening to our country. I think that COVID-19 is the grim background to the story of our losing Tommy at the end of 2020, as well as the insurrection and everything that has followed since then. I mean, under COVID-19, America came very close to becoming a failed state. A failed state is a state that cannot deliver the basic goods of existence to its people, including public health. And we had the President of the United States spreading propaganda and disinformation. He said COVID-19 would disappear overnight and everybody take hydroxychloroquine, and why not shoot yourself with some Clorox? And he never developed a unified strategy for us to defeat the disease. He let it run rampant in the country. In fact, the real advisors he was listening to were people saying that we should just build up natural immunity by letting everybody get the disease. And we lost more than 1 million Americans. And I think that was such a shock to people that the government was not on the side of the public in a public health crisis, that it led to a tremendous despondency and depression and a loss of faith in the country, in our own government. And it was also fertile ground for lies, propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, all the same kinds of lies, propaganda, disinformation, misinformation that fed into Donald Trump's big lie that he had won the election and into the insurrection on January 6th and the attempted political coup. That's the story I try to tell in my book, how these traumas were really linked, at least in my perspective, in our lives, and what we were living through and what we're still living through today, because Donald Trump is still at large and the movement that he unleashed against us is still out there. So we're in the middle of this fight. We'd like it to be over, but we're in the middle of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the interview, Jamie.
Thank you for coming.